Well, from teens to seniors, members of the military to people with substance abuse disorder, suicide impacts virtually every demographic. Here to talk about efforts to change that narrative, we're joined by Jasmine Flowers. She is a survivor and a peer recovery specialist. Jasmine, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Christina Cauffield, CEO at LSF Health Systems. Welcome back, Dr. Cauffield.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
And Nick Padlo, CEO at Sophros Recovery. Am I saying Sophros correctly?
You got it.
All right. Nick, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Nick, before the break, I mentioned that suicide is little discussed in the news relative to its frequency. We know it is essentially twice as common as homicide. But reports are sort of covered up almost by design in the news business. And I wanted to ask you about that. I mean, obviously, there's sort of always been copycat concerns. I'm curious what you feel about whether that is helpful or harmful when it comes to efforts to combat suicide.
It's certainly harmful. All the studies that we have seen show that talking about suicide doesn't increase the risk of someone committing suicide. In fact, it does the opposite, right? So it normalizes it, and it allows us to say, this is something we can talk about, and it's okay if I'm feeling this way, but I need to talk about it, because without getting something treated, without getting it out into the open, it tends to fester and get worse. These things are progressive, right? Most mental health conditions are progressive if left untreated. And so when we don't talk about it, what we do is we allow someone to spiral down into the silence. And that's the exact opposite of what we want.
And I guess there's this sense that normalizing it is something that could lead to other people thinking about it, perhaps that wouldn't be thinking about it. But you don't think that that's the case.
And I think the differentiation is we're not normalizing suicide. We're normalizing talking about suicidal ideation.
Mm-hmm.
So what we're doing is we're giving people the permission to say, hey, I'm not feeling okay today. In fact, I'm feeling really not okay to the point where I don't know if life is worth living anymore. And when we allow people to say that, we can start to ask questions. We can start to have dialogue. And even the process of talking about that a little earlier is cathartic and healing. And so we start to get into a place where we're in a healing space, as opposed to this, we always say in the rooms in addiction, we always say our secrets keep us sick. It's the same thing with mental health. When we don't talk about it, it gets worse, and we get more likely to take that next step as opposed to less likely.
Dr. Cauffield, I just want to put some numbers to what we're talking about, because relative to homicide, which we mentioned, in 2023, there were 148 homicides in Duval County and 176 adults who died by suicide. Obviously, that doesn't include a great many more that attempted suicide and did not end up dying by suicide. What is it, do you think, are we making any progress in terms of communicating just the risk level that exists? Because we do spend a lot of time talking about homicide.
We do. And you're right. And that's why at LSF Health Systems, we said we've got to do more because our statistics here in Jacksonville are not good. We have a higher rate of completed suicides than the state, as well as a higher rate than the nation.
Mm-hmm.
So we said, you know what, we've got to do more. And so that is why we initiated the Zero Suicide Jax program, because we feel very strongly, as Nick has shared, that more people need to understand the gravity of this situation, and they need to understand also that individually they can help in this raising of awareness and knowing the signs and symptoms and being able to talk to somebody that they feel might be struggling, as well as organizations, businesses in the community. Because oftentimes people that are thinking about taking their own lives aren't seeing a therapist. And so you, as their colleague at work or their coach or their teacher or their church fellow member, might be the first one to notice that they are struggling and not themselves. And so we need to equip people and organizations on how to best help people that are struggling with this very serious issue.
And this Zero Suicide Initiative focuses a lot on training gatekeepers. It's sort of the people that you're talking about, people who are perhaps, involved in someone's life or even a little bit more peripheral to their life and may have spotted changes. I wonder, obviously, equipping people to feel like they can do something and intervene when appropriate it empowers them to do that. But is it also risky to just sort of ask people who may not have proper training to sort of insert themselves in what could be a very sort of dicey emotional and psychological set of circumstances?
Right. And so that is why we have a toolkit. If you go to our website, zerosuicidejax.org, there are toolkits, there are tons of resources for training to help individuals ask that difficult question. I'm really worried about you. You don't seem to be yourself. Are you thinking of taking your own life? And it equips them to then take the steps necessary to ensure that that individual that they've just asked that question to has the resources necessary to get themselves some help. And so that's why we're asking individuals and organizations to take the pledge at zerosuicidejax.org because they will have all these resources necessary and the training so that they can make a difference. They too can be a part of reducing the risk of suicide in Jacksonville.
Jasmine, you are currently an advocate and a peer recovery specialist. You also teach trauma-informed yoga, and you are very immersed in the community of recovery.
Yes.
And you also have had your own personal experiences as a survivor. First of all, are you comfortable talking about some of that?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
In particular, the issue of very young people encountering this problem and also coping methods for it. You first were encountering this when you were just very young. Is that right? Can you tell us a little bit about what was happening then?
As a child, I grew up in violence and chaos. And so I had a very traumatic experience happen to me around 8 years old. And at the time, without knowing anything about therapy and or resources, and my mom having no knowledge of anything like that, I was just kind of seeking an escape route. And I didn't know, all these big feelings as a child that I'm having, there are words to them and there are ways to feel better. People can help you and navigate things. So I was feeling incredibly isolated and alone, and I didn't have any way to say, hey, this is what I'm experiencing and this is why. I was afraid. I lived in a space of fear, and nobody told me that what's happening to you and what you're experiencing is not normal. And even then, I think teachers back then were afraid to broach the subjects of like, why is this student now suddenly not doing well in class? Why is this student having these big emotions and no explanation? They just kind of, would send me to a calm corner or, send me to the guidance counselor, and we'd have a brief conversation. But again, without rapport, I didn't feel safe enough to disclose, hey, this is what I'm feeling and experiencing. And I'm sure I got the notion from something I saw on TV of like, oh, I could just, kill myself or, take my own life. And as a child, I had this imagination of like, I'll get a new one, so.
Yeah. And you were very young, just 9 at the time.
Yes, I was 9.
And I think that a lot of people are shocked when they learn that people that young are even thinking about such things, because it seems like such the enormity of it. But it was an issue that persisted throughout your teens as well. And I'm guessing the fact that went sort of untreated or undiagnosed contributed to the fact that it continued.
Right. There was a series of events, so on and so forth, that also were traumatic for me as a young girl that just kind of kept going on. And then around 14, I had a lot of body dysmorphia, and again, just drenched in fear and feeling isolated and feeling really, really misunderstood. And so again, I remember thinking like, there has to be a way out of this feeling. And I discovered boys and alcohol. And I was like, well, if I don't successfully, complete my death by suicide, then I will now just, fully overindulge in these things that are also unhealthy for me because they were another form of escape. And so I navigated just always trying to find ways to escape. And I think that that's one of the biggest common feelings for people when they're feeling super overwhelmed or afraid or isolated is they want to escape the feeling.
Okay. If you're just joining us, we are talking about suicide prevention. We're talking with some people who have survived and continue to advocate in the community, and also a new training program for people who want to get involved. And to help, if you've got comments or questions, you can call us at 904-549-2937. You can email us at firstcoastconnect@wjct.org, or you can reach out on social media. We've got a call from Mark on the South Side. Good morning, Mark. Go ahead.
Hey, good morning. I appreciate the discussion, and I'm just kind of curious, at what point do you, as maybe a loved one or the outsider, when do you recognize that you might have to, Baker Act somebody, physically remove them from an environment and physically take them to a treatment center versus just having that open discussion and trying to, counsel them, let them vent, that kind of a thing? How do you recognize that, and how do you approach that?
That's a very important distinction, Mark.
Mhm.
Well, do you have thoughts on that, Nick? I mean, do you have any advice to offer?
Yeah, so the first thing is, if someone is indicating that they are having some suicidal ideations, that they're thinking about it, it's probably still too early, potentially. But what that does is it cues us up to ask follow-on questions. And those are the questions we often hear about in terms of means and intent. Have you thought about how you would do it? Do you have the ability? And the other thing we want to look at is protective factors. What are the things that are keeping you from doing it? Well, my religious beliefs, I want to be here for my kids. And so there's no clear-cut answer of, if these questions are yes, then I call for a Baker Act. But what we can do is we can say, okay, let me kind of weigh this evidence and say, okay, they're having suicidal ideation and they've thought about it. They know exactly how they're going to do it. Let me make a call to somebody to see what's going on. And there are a lot of professionals that can kind of help guide that too. I know, like at Sophros, for example, if someone calls us, one of our clinicians can talk to them, right? And so you can get additional resources to make that call. But the thing I would say is, we don't want to overdo it because it can be traumatic, right? The whole process of a Baker Act can be traumatic. And we also need to err on the side of caution because this is someone's life, right? So I would rather you make that call a minute too early than a day too late, right? We don't want to make it or even a day too early than a minute too late, right?
Yeah.
We don't want to make it weeks too early when it's like, hey, I have thought about, taking my life by suicide. Okay, let me call and have the police come here and take you to a treatment center. No, okay, probably not there. But if someone starts to indicate, okay, I'm spiraling down, we're dipping deeper into substances, now we need to make that call, even if it's hard to make.
So you deal very often with military members, former military members, and the community of people that have a different set of challenges sometimes altogether when it comes to suicide or suicidal ideation. But before we talk about that, in terms of the conversation you're talking about having with someone, I mean, obviously it takes an enormous amount of courage and investment for someone to begin that conversation. But what is it that makes someone receptive to hearing those? Because I would feel that, perhaps somebody that is experiencing that would be really reluctant to open up about it, talk about it, particularly if it's a coworker or a colleague or somebody they know from church, whether they would just suddenly say, well, yes, I'm experiencing all of these, terrible thoughts.
So the first thing is that the ability to have these conversations starts way before we have them. So what we want to do in our lives is practice having real conversations with our loved ones. Practice asking difficult questions. Practice talking about emotions and feelings. Normalize that, right? Start those conversations early. Start them now with your family. Start having difficult conversations and asking hard questions about feelings and emotions and being more open and vulnerable. Then when you ask that question, it doesn't seem like such a leap. Hey, we've never talked about anything other than the Jaguars, and now I'm going to ask you if you're taking your own life. Like, you've never demonstrated care for me before. Why would I share with you now? And so the first thing is, I would say we start it early. The other thing that I would say is we want to focus on asking questions rather than giving advice. Doesn't mean we never give advice. We can. There will be a time and place perhaps. But there's a concept called motivational interviewing, where what you're doing is you're asking a series of questions. And when you feel like you're about to give advice, you ask another question, right? So instead of saying, hey, or have you had any thoughts of dying by suicide? Yeah, I've thought about it. Well, what you need to do is you need to go to treatment. You need to call a therapist. Ask the question, have you ever thought about talking to a therapist? Has that ever been something that's crossed your mind? Do you think that would be helpful? Why don't you think it would be helpful? And then every time you feel like giving a statement and giving advice, ask another question.
Mm.
And then when you hear something that's helpful, when they say something that's helpful, now you echo it back. And you start to guide that into a more kind of advice flow of conversation.
For instance, if they say that their family is an important source of support, sort of echo that back to them.
Yeah. So I'm hearing that your family is an important source of support. Have you thought about reaching out to them this week? Well, no, but maybe I could. Okay. Could you do that today? And so we just keep asking questions and getting to the point where we're kind of driving toward the action we want.
Jasmine, does it sound like those kind of conversations would have been helpful to you at age 9, at age 14, or, back in 2025, which I think was kind of the most recent and perhaps most serious incident that you had? Would those have been conversations that would have reached you at those various ages? And if not, what might have been more helpful?
Yeah. Well, not in 2025. I was going to be 25, so this is about 10 years ago.
I'm sorry, 2015.
No worries. I
Yeah.
was like, absolutely. Just like I mentioned, rapport, having no rapport, only talking about, very surface level things with somebody would not have made me comfortable enough to then have that deep conversation of how I'm feeling. And I think creating safety in any dynamic within any relationship, there is a level of intimacy there that allows for hard conversations and uncomfortable things to be said and shared. And I think that it's not a taboo subject if more people were to say, even if you're not having the, ideations immediately, but you're feeling exhausted every day, your emotions always feel out of control, you are having all of these feelings that are overwhelming you, it can easily on a random Sunday become a feeling of, I'm having suicidal ideation. So if you're already able to articulate and have conversations saying, I'm feeling tired literally every other day of my life, I'm emotionally distressed, I'm having this, I'm suffering here, I'm suffering there, then it allows for somebody to say, you've repeatedly said over and over that you're tired. How can we help you solve this feeling, this heaviness, before it gets to the point of, I see no escape route to what I'm feeling? Because I think that for me, I was in a really abusive relationship and I moved across the country to be away from him because I was afraid of him. And I remember feeling so isolated and so alone and so ashamed that I was in this relationship. How could I have grown up seeing this and still make these kind of mistakes or, poor decisions as I had seen them as? And I really, really didn't value myself or my own life. And so carrying that and not sharing it with anybody, again, created this notion of, it's just me. I'm the only person who makes continual mistakes. I'm the only person who, is full of shame and guilt and remorse when no, that's impossible. That is a human experience. And if more people were to say, I also have felt shame, guilt, remorse, I've made mistakes, I've suffered in this kind of way, then it creates this, oh, I'm not alone, which is one of the biggest things that when I hear people say, because I ask this question every single day at Sophros, when I hear people say, well, yes, I am having suicidal ideations, but I don't have a plan, then you don't have to assess protective factors. But if they're like, yes, actually, I have a plan, I actually have a weapon at home, then we have to go through a whole route of assessing. But I think that at the end of the day, when you can have that conversation and say to somebody, okay, I too have felt this way, it creates this all of a sudden the floodgates open to this free feeling of, wow, I'm not alone in this.
Dr. Cauffield, I was surprised recently on a doctor visit where the intake nurse who kind of does your blood pressure and your pulse oximeter, whatever, was asking all of these questions. Have you felt, depressed? Have you felt worthless? Kind of all of these questions that might address somebody who might be having suicidal ideation is very routine, I guess, now, which I think is an interesting form of progress on this conversation. But, she's a clinician. She has a place to take that information. If people are asking these questions, and I know you say that there's this training that's available, but do they have to sort of be in a place where they're able and willing to take on an emotional chore or an emotional and psychological burden of sorts to be willing to sort of stay in the game, to be willing to walk with that person if they need additional help?
Right. Well, I tend to look at it as helping that individual connect to the resources they need. So we don't have to become therapists or feel like, oh my goodness, we're going to have to be in this person's life every single day and check in and so on. Although connection is very important. But the whole point of Zero Suicide Jax initiative is helping people know what questions to ask and then know what resources are in the community to connect that individual. For example, one resource is 988. That is the emergency number, just like 911 is if you have a physical illness and a physical emergency. 988 is for anyone struggling with an emotional issue, anyone struggling with thoughts of taking their own life. So simply by saying, I'm with you, I hear what you're saying. Did you know that a simple 3-number call, 988, will connect you to a therapist that will help guide you through this very rough time? I'm here for you. I care for you. And why don't we make the call together? So as an individual, you don't have to have all the answers clinically, but just by caring, asking the question, getting the information, and then the connection to community resources. That is really key.
Nick, your thoughts?
One of the best comparisons that I've heard between these conversations about suicide and the initiatives that LSF is doing with Zero Suicide is similar to CPR. When we do CPR training, when we think about CPR, we think about someone jumping in and saving a life. And that does happen with CPR. But the biggest impact from all of the CPR training that's been done in the United States is that people recognize the signs and symptoms of a heart attack earlier and they call 911 faster. That's how CPR saves lives. It does save lives practically in the same way that you might be able to talk to someone and they don't want to, any longer take their life by suicide. And the biggest impact that this stuff is going to have is going to be connecting people to resources earlier so that professionals can do intervention in just the same way that we do with CPR.
That is so interesting. We are almost out of time, but I do want to ask you, in terms of reaching young people, and we know there's so many more challenges, AI, chatbots and social media. Do you have any specific advice for people who are either teachers or parents?
I think to what Nicholas was saying and Dr. Cauffield, it's incredibly important to already have conversations. Like I have 2 wonderful daughters and they're 9 and 7. So they're still really like at an age where most of things are pretty innocent and fun and easy breezy, but they also have big feelings and emotions. And I'm constantly having emotional conversations with them so that I create this feeling of safety and this knowing that like you can have the ability to talk to me about certain things.